I've said it before, and I'll say it again. There are gradations in the state of warfare that can exist between two countries. The experience of the Iraq War, which began with a full scale, preeminent invasion, has, I think, distorted the conception in the minds of some of what U.S., in particular, warfare consists of. The Iraq War was, in a sense, a unique event because it was undertaken by a president, George W. Bush, who was operating at the behest of a group of ideologues who were in his administration. And it wasn't in response to an attack on any U.S. people or U.S. installations or forces. It was an ideological endeavor that had been in the planning for quite a while, and the war was initiated by a full scale, fully mobilized invasion. Now, is that what's happening right now? No. As far as we can tell, there is no full scale ground invasion of Iran happening in the next couple days or weeks or months, or at least that's not what's being signaled. But that doesn't mean that we're not in a state of war. And how do I know that we're in a state of war? Well, because a massively escalatory act of war was committed when the senior most general in Iran was assassinated, leading to an explosion in public mourning, some of which you might argue was coerced or manipulated, but at least a large percentage of which was organic. And then the Iranian government had no choice but to retaliate, which they did by launching rockets at U.S. military installations. So that signifies that the U.S. and Iran are in a state of direct warfare. Or, in other words, a new war has been initiated in the Middle East. Again, does that mean that the entire U.S. military is going to be deployed to invade Iran tomorrow? No, but that doesn't mean that it's not a state of war. Have you studied the Vietnam War, for instance? Are you aware that the Vietnam War did not begin with a full-scale invasion and occupation of the country? It began gradually over time, and then once the U.S. was invested in an outcome, escalated to the point where many thousands of U.S. troops were deployed. And ultimately 52 or 3,000 killed. So it's a state of war, and I have some Trump supporters and nationalists and Republicans and others, tweeting at me frenetically today and saying, "Oh, you were wrong. You should apologize." As if I'm supposed to be grateful and happy and pleased that a totally unnecessary crisis was manufactured, resulting in direct state-to-state warfare between the U.S. and Iran. Up until yesterday, Iran had not dared to directly attack U.S. forces in the way that it just did. So that alone is a massive escalatory step. It doesn't matter exactly that no U.S. forces were killed. It means that now the US and Iran are in this direct confrontational state of hostilities. But I'm supposed to be glad and appreciative of this for some reason because it hasn't yet resulted in World War III. Really? So not instigating World War III is the standard now? It's kind of a low bar, wouldn't you say? I was never one of these people who was shouting about World War III because number one, there are still people who fought in World War II who are around. And I don't think that shouting World War III without due consideration and circumspection is appropriate, especially given the fact that there are people who were, again, in the previous World War who are still alive. And I almost feel it dishonors them in a way to be flippant with proclamations of World War III. So I never engaged in that. That's not how I describe the situation. What I described it as was an act of war being committed, which it was, and then a retaliatory act of war being committed, which also it was. That's what the Iranian response was yesterday. So that is now a back and forth of warfare, which has brought us to a new phase of hostilities with Iran. Do we think that everybody's just going to take their ball and go home now? Have the neocons who are surrounding Trump exited their positions of power? No. They're more dug in than ever. Trump has validated them more than he ever has up until this point. So what happens now if there is some other attack? I mean, Trump already threatened to rain down hellfire upon Iran, including their cultural sites. So he threatened basically to obliterate ancient civilizational landmarks in Persia. And that's what's in the offing should something else come down the pike. And who's to say that won't happen? Soleimani already has a successor who has vowed vengeance. The supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei, has said that these retaliatory airstrikes yesterday just amounted to, quote, a slap in the face. And their ultimate objective is to expel the U.S. entirely from the region. Now, Trump, you think, would embrace the opportunity to expel or remove U.S. troops from the region, but instead he has deployed more. I think the latest count is something like 13 or 14,000 since last summer, with more deployed in the wake of the Soleimani assassination. So we've already been told by the supreme leader of Iran and by the successor of Soleimani in the Quds force that what occurred yesterday is not the end. They say they don't want war, but nobody says that they want war. I dug up a quote yesterday of Colin Powell in 2003 saying the same thing. We don't want war, but we're being forced into a position where we have to wage war. So only a true psychopath, and there may well be some psychopaths in positions of power, but only a true psychopath would prance around screaming that he or she wants war, and frankly, it's pretty much guaranteed to be a he. Although there are probably some psychopathic women around there too who would say something to that effect. But that's a side issue. The point is that this brinksmanship and this extreme escalatory conduct has now created a more dangerous situation in terms of a brand new full-fledged conflict than has occurred at any time in recent history. And so I don't want to be told that I have to stand up and celebrate because this totally unnecessary crisis has not yet resulted in a full-scale regime change invasion or World War III. I think our standards for responsible statecraft should be a little more strict than that. And if you want to, prance around touting how wonderful it is that this so-called bad guy was assassinated, my follow-up question is, okay, so now what happens when the next quote-unquote bad guy comes to power and does essentially the same thing? More assassinations? More threats? Where does it end? Trump today in his remarks said that they were still evaluating their options with regard to further military retaliation. What does that mean? Well, it means that war on a more wide scale is not off the menu. What if they again shoot down one of these unmanned drones, which created which allegedly precipitated the last crisis in June of last year? What if they attack a Saudi installation? What if one of these proxies, as they're called, launches some kind of incursion on U.S. installations in Iraq? Where does it end? The point is that we've reached a point, a phase of escalation where another of these relatively small scale events could be cited as justification for a full scale war. And I'm not going to accept this idea that we having now reached a point where full scale war is far more likelier than it was a couple days ago is something to be celebrated just because the full out war has not yet begun. Especially when this entire thing was 100% avoidable. I would recommend that some of you go read, especially if you are of a more pro-Trump inclination, a piece that was just published and I just saw about a half hour ago in the American Conservative magazine, where I wrote for years and haven't in a little while, but maybe we'll return to that at some point. But one of the co-founders, who I know, Scott McConnell, wrote a piece about how troubled he is by the situation because he was somebody who voted for Trump in 2016 on the premise that Trump potentially represented a new way forward for American conservatism, right? So a dispatching of the neocons, an embrace of the idea that war need not be sort of the animating impulse of the conservative coalition, given that George W. Bush's legacy had been repudiated. The American Conservative magazine was founded in opposition to the Iraq War. So McConnell supported Trump under the impression that Trump would actually be able to change the broader orientation of conservatism in the U.S. so that war was something that was seen as anathema. or at least unnecessary wars, of which this latest Iran confrontation would be a chief example. And McConnell ends his piece, or rather, let me explain where he began it. He began it by recounting a personal conversation that he had with Trump at where else, a golf club, where they ran into one another in the bathroom. And McConnell says that, they exchanged pleasantries and kind of golf chit chat until McConnell said to Trump, just one thing: no war with Iran. And Trump said, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's all talk. There won't be war." Well, guess what? We're in a state of war now with Iran. And you can deny that all you want. You can quibble with the semantics, but explain to me how you would characterize the first time ever, at least since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, that the two states have been engaged in direct warfare, not through proxies, which has obviously occurred for quite a while, not through sort of incidental, circumstantial conflicts, but no, direct state-to-state warfare on their respective military targets. How would you characterize that if not a state of war? Don't tell me that because there's no Iraq-style invasion yet, that's not warfare. It is. And we don't know where it's going. All the senior figures in the Trump administration, from the defense secretary, who was previously a top lobbyist for Raytheon and stands to benefit financially from war, from Pompeo, who's the sort of theocratic neocon, from the acolyte of John Bolton, who took over as national security advisor, and everybody kind of celebrated when Bolton was fired, but it just turned out that his lackey assumed the position, which in a way is sort of more dangerous because John Bolton's cartoonish hawkishness almost in a way provided Trump with a foil so he could look like the less aggressive guy in the room. And now you just have somebody who basically has the same views, but is a little more judicious in how he expresses them. This guy, O'Brien. Et cetera, et cetera. Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham being keyed into all these conversations, strategy-wise. So you're telling me that you are comfortable with this situation? Trump announced that his next step is to impose even more sanctions on Iran. I don't even know what sanctions are left, frankly, to impose, but that is perceived correctly by Iran to be economic warfare. So if now the response to this confrontation is more sanctions, what does that project about the U.S. intentions? It projects that they're perfectly willing to just see where this goes. And I'm not going to permit myself, nor should you, to be bullied into believing that this is somehow at all a rational scenario that we find ourselves in. I agree, again, with Tulsi, who says the following. This is after she received her intelligence briefing in D.C. She left New Hampshire unexpectedly, went to D.C. to participate in intelligence briefings and to presumably vote on the War Powers resolution invocation tomorrow. And she, after receiving her briefing, she said, quote, that she said that the Trump officials provided, quote, no justification whatsoever for this illegal and unconstitutional act of war and, quote, failed to provide any compelling information to prove their point of imminence. So the rationale that was presented to the American people to justify this massively escalatory act of war has not been at all substantiated or corroborated, at least according to Tulsi, whose judgment on this and related matters I would trust a tad more than the likes of Mike Pompeo and, frankly, Donald Trump. And if you choose to side with somebody like Pompeo over somebody like Tulsi, then I guess that's your prerogative. But I think Tulsi has demonstrated that she was probably warrant the benefit of the doubt, especially on foreign policy issues of this nature. But it's not just her. Don't take one Democrat's word for it. Take what Senator Mike Lee, Republican of Utah, said after emerging from the Senate briefing from Trump administration officials who were trying to provide a rationale for this act of war. Lee was visibly angry when he was speaking to the press about it. He said that the Trump administration briefers who were conducting the briefing said, quote, do not debate, do not discuss the issue of the appropriateness of further military intervention against Iran. Because, according to Lee's account, any debate along those lines would just embolden Iran. Lee described it as the worst briefing he's ever received on military-related issues in the entire time that he's been in the Senate. And he was elected in 2010. He called the Trump administration briefing, quote, absolutely insane and a, quote, stunt. This is Mike Lee, Republican of Utah, not some fire-breathing left-wing SJW or whatever you want to invent to make it seem as though this is all about people who are afflicted with Trump derangement syndrome. I like to think that I've kind of established something of a reputation for not having Trump derangement syndrome. I don't feel it's a useful mode of analysis for the most part, because for one thing, it would have sucked you down into this Russiagate sinkhole and the ensuing impeachment sinkhole. So I don't have that syndrome. In fact, I've broadly supported some Trump foreign policy initiatives, including his direct personal diplomacy in North Korea. Obviously, there are some reasons for concern about how that all is going to unfold, but on principle, I thought that meeting with Kim Jong-un directly, forging a personal relationship with him, and even going into North Korean territory was a positive step. And one way in which that Trump actually distinguished himself from the average neocon indebted Republican. I don't think that you would have had any other candidate who ran the 2016 primary, with the possible exception of Rand Paul, who would have engaged in that kind of personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. Maybe not even any Democrat would have done it. So that was something that I thought was uniquely to Trump's credit. And also, I supported such initiatives as Trump's claimed full withdrawal from Syria that he announced on Twitter in December of 2018, but which then was overridden and essentially negated. So I initially supported the announcement of a full withdrawal from Syria. It was well past time. And I was critical of the hyperbolic, frantic reaction to that, as though it was directed by Putin, or as though it was, the end of American hegemonic prowess in the world, which, to be honest, wouldn't be a horrible thing given how American hegemonic prowess has generally been wielded. But I was not afflicted with Trump derangement syndrome in either of those two scenarios and took a lot of heat, to put it mildly, from liberals and Democrats on those issues. And there are more that I could name, many of which relate in one way or another to the Russiagate impeachment fiasco. So that's not my political orientation. In fact, and I mentioned this on Twitter earlier, if you think that I'm crazy on this Iran subject, okay, fine. Make your arguments to the contrary, but do not accuse me of being some kind of knee-jerk partisan where I'm only going after Trump because I hate him and I don't want Trump to get any credit for taking out the bad guy. Rah, rah, USA. I posted a link earlier today of an article that I wrote from the 2012 Democratic Convention, actually in the American Conservative magazine, recounting how I was thrown out of the Democratic Convention because I had the journalistic audacity to go up to Valerie Jarrett, remember her, the Obama consigliere, and ask her about drone strikes, which then was a pretty live issue, especially given Obama's expansion of the drone program and how it had been used to kill, in one case, an American citizen and his young child. So I see these like pro-Trump MAGA Inc., MAGA Incorporated accounts basically promoting this idea that anybody who's registering criticisms now is a total hypocrite because they never cared when it was done under Obama. Well, number one, as staunch of a critic as I was of, for example, the Obama drone program, it's just a fact that Obama never used drone strikes to assassinate any high-ranking government officials. So there's a distinction there. Not a distinction that makes Obama look great necessarily, but still a notable distinction. And you have these, but nonetheless, I and others who at least strive to maintain some semblance of consistency did register criticisms of Obama, not least for the Libya invasion or intervention, which, according to the definition now being presented, must not have been a war because there was no full-scale ground invasion by U.S. troops. It was aerial bombardment. But again, nonetheless, you can go check the record. I was a staunch critic of the Libya invasion. And I didn't cheer when Gaddafi was basically killed in the streets by radicals. So any of these sort of, Trump boosting social media accounts who want to make it seem like nobody has a principled position here, they're just feeding you BS. Are there some people who don't have a principled position? Sure. But if they're the only ones that you engage with, you're not going to have even access to those who might be approaching this from more consistent, principled grounds. Rand Paul, who is an ally of Mike Lee's, and generally they share a similar ideological disposition, said himself today that the legal rationale cited by the Trump administration for the Soleimani strike was, quote, absurd and an insult. because what they're apparently citing is the 2002 Iraq authorization for use of force. So think about that. While you are, cheering that a bad guy was taken out, like an elementary school kid, the administration has essentially fabricated a public rationale for how their strike was justified. The 2002 Iraq war vote, really? The same vote that Trump has campaigned on being such a disaster? He's now invoking that to justify direct military confrontation with Iran just because it happened to take place in Iraq, and ignoring that the sovereign government of Iraq opposes this to the point that they voted in their parliament to expel U.S. forces from the country? Really? So I guess Mike Lee and Rand Paul would have to be some of these, Trump derangement syndrome sufferers who, have nothing consistent to say about anything and are just, foaming at the mouth with hatred for Trump, right? Right. So if you're okay with the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and others obviously concocting an unfounded justification for military hostilities, then have at it. But that's not my MO, and I don't care who the president is. And if you ascribe hypocrisy or some kind of other nefarious motive to anybody who criticizes such propaganda, then that really says more about you than it does about me. That means that your political views are really skin deep and don't amount to much of anything except reflexive boosterism. Now, if you're a neocon, if you're somebody who has a principled position in favor of this kind of stuff, okay. I mean, at least I can contend with that on a intelligible level, right? But the ones I think that you're wicked essentially, but nonetheless, at least that's sort of a graspable position that one could argue with. But much more irritating, I think, are the people who parrot neocon hyper nationalistic synergy views and and just all out of like a boosterism impulse. They're the ones who annoy me the most. And by the way, now that the Trump administration is citing the 2002 authorization for use of military force in Iraq to justify armed hostilities with Iran, kind of be a good opportunity to hold Joe Biden's feet to the fire over that vote. But don't just make it all about the 2002 vote. Make it about how he continues to misrepresent the nature of his position on Iraq today in 2019 and 2020. If you go back on this channel, you'll find an example of me personally, MT, talking to Joe Biden in September of last year about his Iraq war position. And Joe Biden tells a gigantic whopper, which was that he claimed to have opposed the Iraq war before it began. So he generally says that he opposed the Iraq war right after it began. But to me, for whatever reason, he decided to stretch the misrepresentation further and say that he opposed it before it began. And the consequences of that vote reverberate 18 years later, which is kind of amazing. But we are now in a position where we may have the third Democratic presidential nominee who voted in favor of that authorization for use of military force in Iraq, all of whom probably lose. Actually, I don't know if Biden will win or lose. I think he actually has a reasonably good chance. I'm not going to prognosticate on that right now. But John Kerry lost when he voted for the Iraq War and then tried to kind of manufacture a very convoluted justification for it that kind of merged a strategic criticism he had of George W. Bush's conduct of the war with a pro-war a position which made out his vote to be proper. Of course, Hillary Clinton voted for it. We don't have to go down that rabbit hole. And sure enough, she lost in 2016. The only guy who's a Democrat who's won since the Iraq War is Barack Obama. Remember him? And he did not vote for the authorization for use of military force in Iraq because he was not in the Senate. I mean, he says he would have opposed it regardless. But the point is that the Iraq vote is such an albatross that it continues to be Devil Biden now, all these years later, and it takes on new ramifications. So it's not just about the 2002 vote per se. It's that the vote is now being cited by the Trump administration as a legal rationale for why they are permitted to assassinate senior-most members of the Iranian military, where even Rand Paul says that justification is an absurd and an insult. So if you're okay with being insulted, if you're okay with your intelligence being insulted by people who want to justify new military conflicts, then have a party. But I'm not going to attend that party. I'm going to maintain my critical faculties to the best of my ability. I'm going to continue to highlight how the Russiagate / impeachment fiasco is such a nonsensical non-starter, and I'm not going to perceive any conflict between the two. That, to me, is entirely consistent. So if you are in this chat, or if you're, one of these gloaters who think that because we're not literally in World War III, that everything is fine, then take a step back and understand what you're actually saying there, because it's got some fairly ominous implications. Okay, I have a super chat from individual Jeffrey. Says, very much appreciate your informed and thoughtful analysis. Excellent work, always here and in print. Thank you very much, sir. Nice of you to say. Got another one from Jennifer, who says, thank you for being a true journalist, Tulsi 2020. Thank you. Somebody else says, if you want to understand Trump backers' lack of panic, you need to read Win Bigly by Scott Adams. I don't think you're a hypocrite. You and Bannon are right on this. Risk of unintended consequences is high. I mean, I'm assuming if I were to read Win Bigly by Scott Adams, the idea is that I would come to understand how this was all part of, Trump's, 86-dimensional chess plan, right? So that has tended to be how a lot of Trump supporters have justified his actions, which on first blush don't seem particularly productive or smart, but they all say that it's part of this very long series of chess moves that will result in a win at the end. And the most kind of loony example of that being the QAnon people, who kind of apply that analysis to everything. What kind of chess move is it to send thousands of more troops to the Middle East? What's the chess move entailed by essentially fabricating a pro-war justification for why the assassination took place. If you feel like it was such a necessary thing for the U.S. to engage in this attack, why are you throwing out all these nonsensical justifications, tying them to 9/11, the imminent threat stuff, which is obviously so reminiscent of the Iraq War? Um, why not just state the true rationale? Republicans and Democrats can see through it. So, I mean, does Scott Adams have some kind of really intelligent explanation for this? I'm sure he's got one that kind of like sounds coherent with the rest of the way that he's presented the Trump presidency. But I'm not that interested in that. What I'm interested in is just looking at what the facts are, and the facts do not bode particularly well for anybody who believes that U.S. foreign policy is a gigantic mess, because what's happened in the past week is that mess has gotten far worse. um, so yeah, Scott Adams can do what he likes, but doesn't mean I have to take it particularly seriously when there are far better ways to analyze recent events. All right, people. Any other comments? Happy to field. I'm still in New Hampshire, as you might be able to tell from my surroundings, which are not my normal location. Have now gone to a Tulsa event every day since the 29th, just because I feel there is a void in terms of her being covered in a way that is rational and fair, and actually provides insight about what her candidacy and political persona represents. So, I've taken the initiative to fill the void to the extent that I can. You might have seen some of my tweets from her events, etc. She again went back to DC today, so she Skyped in to an event in New Hampshire with uh, Kim Iverson, who I've had on my channel before, and who I'm friendly with. So that was interesting. Um, um, and there was a little bit of a disruption toward the end of the event tonight, which was I don't even really want to get into, because it gives credence to people who I don't feel necessarily deserve it. Sorry to be cryptic about it, but if you follow some of the more vituperative online commentary about Tulsa, you might figure out who the type of people would be who would want to interrupt one of her events. Somebody says, any chance you'll be back on Tucker? I when you get invited on a TV show, it tends to be the day of, and not something you really plan out ahead of time. So it's always possible. I think shows tend to cycle through guests in a way. So I haven't been on in a couple months, but it's fine. I don't kind of plan my schedule or what I focus on around getting on TV. If it happens, fine. But it's just not a major priority for me, frankly. So always happy to appear on his or any other show. But when you are somewhat heterodox in your political outlook, it doesn't always align neatly with what television show bookers are looking for. So yeah, so be it. But I appreciate Tucker's role to the extent that he's checked or attempted to check some of Trump's worst impulses on these subjects. Um, the people who claim that Tucker's political evolution has been purely cynical or opportunistic, I think kind of have to reckon with the fact that he, um, since this Iran fiasco occurred, he has been basically skewering the propaganda coming out of the Trump administration. He couches it in a way that I think uh, sort of gives the benefit of the doubt to Trump, but it's effective. And he's got a platform where it can actually make a difference. So I guess you have to credit Tucker for doing something that truly does cut against the grain from his platform on primetime Fox, where the incentive, presumably ratings-wise, would just be to beat the war drums. That's what Hannity is doing. That's what pretty much everybody else on Fox is doing, right? Somebody says, will you apologize to the dissident right for your inaccurate claim that they want war with Iran? You got to see, this is the problem when you deal with people on the internet. You got to cite what claim you're saying is inaccurate. What specific claim are you saying that I leveled was inaccurate? Cite it. Show me the clip or the tweet or whatever. What I've ridiculed are the people who posture themselves as MAGA. I've called them MAGA Inc. in a mocking way, who are bad, who were aggressively defending this action, and in some cases, demanding full-out war with Iran. I'll give you just a personal example. Last night I was at Tulsi's event again, and there was a New Hampshire state rep who was there, who's a Trump supporter. He was there at Tulsi's event, right? So Trump supporters got the Trump pin on. Told me that he was definitely voting for Trump. Nothing could change that. But he was there because he thought that Tulsi would be the most dangerous candidate against Trump, meaning that she would have the best chance to win against Trump. I don't know why I just took my glasses off there. So I was kind of, but he in a way, had like respect for Tulsi because she had defied the Democratic Party or whatever. So I just got to chatting with him, and you can go look him up. His name is Werner Horn. I feel like somebody who expresses a view as totally sadistic and crazy as he did should be mentioned publicly, so maybe his constituents can let him know how they feel. But he told me that, so I got to asking him, like, what? So you you have to respect Tulsi in a way, but you're also saying that her foreign policy views are anathema. I mean, he called her an isolationist, and he said that he totally disagreed with her on Iran. And in fact, he told me that he believes that nation building is good, and the U.S. should spread its benevolent influence all over the world by invading and occupying countries, including Iran, which he said that it would be a great idea for Trump to invade and overthrow the government of directly. So that guy told me that person to person, face to face. He got the Trump pin on, saying he's all Trump, definitely voting for him. And so if your little dissident right online clique is not for war with Iran or has not defended this assassination and subsequent retaliatory action, okay, good. But I think you should recognize that a lot of people are making a lot of money with the MAGA brand, and they are cheering this stuff. I could name names, but I don't really want to get into any like petty online feuds, but you could find them pretty easily. So I don't know what exactly you're referring to by dissident right, but I acknowledge that there are some exceptions. There's a collection of people on the internet who are right wingers who are against this sort of thing. But there's a loud majority who are staunchly in favor of basically anything Trump does, come hell or high water, including this assassination, which I maintain brought us into a state of direct warfare with Iran, of such a nature that has not ever happened before. And again, I'm not going to be bullied into celebrating that in any way, especially when it was 100% avoidable, and especially when the rationale for it was more or less fabricated. In my travails around New Hampshire, I've okay, so the guy who made the comment replies, just because Seb Gorka calls his show America First doesn't make it so. That's who I meant. Okay, fine. If that's who you meant, then I guess I wasn't referring to you. I'm referring to the people who are doing that. And I could name many more examples, but again, I don't want to get into that kind of tit for tat online. It's not worth it, especially with that kind of crew. Okay, I'll name one. Right, Charlie Kirk. I know you're going to call him. I don't know what you're going to call him. You're going to disown him, whatever. But this is a guy who loves to claim how MAGA he is. He just was advertising his new book, which is essentially like a MAGA manifesto. He has direct access to Trump. He was just partying with him on New Year's Eve in Mar-a-Lago. And Charlie Kirk, loves this situation, saying how great it is that Trump showed such impressive strength by initiating the state of war in the Middle East. So that's the type of person that I'm referring to. Place themselves under the MAGA banner, and yet all they do is just boosterize. They are boosters. And so if my criticism doesn't apply to you, okay, so be it. But please understand that there are plenty of people to whom it does apply. And, I'm a registered Democrat, right? I generally have situated myself on, I don't know, I guess I would call it the slightly heterodox left. So what I criticize Democrats and liberal leftists all the time, and I sometimes do so by necessity, by generalizing, but that doesn't preclude people who are exceptions, of which I would be one, right? So I'm not condemning myself when I condemn people who I feel are behaving badly, who have that or are in that ideological cohort, right? Somebody asks, Michael, why are you so loud right now relative to Obama's years? Again, I just have to ask people who would ask a question like that. Like, what's your evidence? How do you know that I wasn't loud right during Obama's years? Did you follow me then? Did you see what I was saying? I just told you of an example of when I was literally physically ejected from the 2012 Democratic Convention because I was asking a senior Obama advisor about foreign policy issues. Okay, he says he's followed me for years. I was vocal about this stuff back then, so maybe you weren't following me closely enough. But the fact remains that Obama did not assassinate a top official on the magnitude of Soleimani in a foreign country. So the crisis right now is a little different from the crises that occurred under Obama. So I'm kind of just reacting to events as I see them. Somebody says I followed you for 4 years, maybe 5. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I got in 2016, my following, such as it exists, definitely ballooned quite a bit. So I feel like there were a lot of people who started following me like just around the time of the campaign. Yeah, which is fine. And but you can go check many of the things that I tweeted and wrote and said, from 2010 to 2016, and you'll find many examples of me making criticisms that are thoroughly consistent with the criticism I'm making now. The point is that Trump is, Obama was surrounded by humanitarian interventionists, so to say, some hawks, such as Hillary Clinton. Um, but he wasn't quite as infiltrated with just full-fledged neocons and nationalists as Trump now is. And Trump had an opportunity to not fill his administration with those types of people because he had a mandate after having defeated them in the Republican primary to actually do something different personnel wise, and he didn't follow through on that. So Trump has a unique set of issues that are specific to him, as this Iran thing demonstrates. Obama, for all my criticisms of him, and even if the Iran deal may have had some problems, he brought U.S. relations with Iran to a less confrontational posture than they have been at any point since the Iranian Revolution, which was a good thing, I think, because it was a positive step forward in not bringing us to this brink of war with Iran. I know I'm probably going to have people in the comments right now saying, "Oh yeah, because we gave them pallets of cash." I mean, can you just go look up what that actually meant when the so-called pallets of cash were delivered to Iran? Tulsi was actually asked a question about this last night by somebody who was ranting about how wonderful the Soleimani assassination is. It was money that they were owed that was unfrozen due to certain sanctions being lifted. Okay, so the whole pallets of cash thing, and Trump even continued it today when he claimed without any basis whatsoever that Iran purchased the missiles from the money that they got through the Iran deal. I mean, it's just nonsense. And actually, Scott McConnell mentioned that in his piece that I talked about earlier. And again, this is the co-founder of the American Conservative magazine who voted for Trump and spoke to Trump personally about Iran. I don't think he's suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. I just have to reflect on the irony of me now being, disowned by some of these, I guess, pro-Trump or whatever affiliated people who want to ascribe some kind of partisan motivation. Okay, that same guy Evan says, so your claim is we didn't actually give them money, we just lifted sanctions that resulted in getting hundreds of billions of dollars. I'm saying as part of the Iran deal, which they were complying with, funds were unfrozen that they had been owed. It wasn't as if the U.S. Treasury just printed up a bunch of money and handed it over to Iran. So I don't think it's a good idea, whatever problems you might have with the deal, to unilaterally withdraw from it, not honor your obligations to it just because the administration changed. And now what has it gotten for us? An escalated state of war with Iran. So should have stayed in the deal. I mean, the propaganda campaign against the Iran deal is a total function of the neocon think tanks and their media allies. They're the ones who've been churning this out constantly with, by the way, an assist from Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu came to the U.S. Congress to urge them not to adopt the Iran deal. Talk about foreign interference, right? And that's what they've done. And Trump bought into it. And, people told him that's a bad idea. if you want to extricate the U.S. from the Middle East, because it makes it more likely that armed conflict will break out, and sure enough, armed conflict is broken out. So, okay, over an hour now. Gonna leave it there. Have a good night, everybody. Talk to you later.